Spring MVC most asked interview questions. What is Spring MVC? Spring MVC is a part of the Spring framework used to create web applications. It helps organize the application into three parts, that is model, view and controller. This separation makes the app easier to manage. The Spring MVC also provides tools for handling user requests, checking data, and connecting different parts of the app, making web development easier and more efficient. What are the core components of Spring MVC? The core components of Spring MVC includes dispatcher servlet, controller, model, view, and view resolver. Dispatcher servlet handles incoming requests and directs them to the right controller. Controllers process these requests, interact with the model to get or update data, and decide which view to show. The view resolver matches the view name to the actual view, which displays the data to the user. Describe the lifecycle of Spring MVC request. In Spring MVC, when a user makes a request, dispatcher servlet receives it first and finds the right controller. The controller processes the request, works with the model to get or update the data, and returns the name of a view. Dispatcher servlet then uses view resolver to find the correct view. Finally, the view creates the response and showing the data to the user. What role does the dispatcher servlet play in this life cycle? The dispatcher servlet is the main part of a Spring MVC. It gets all incoming requests, finds the right controller to handle them, and manages the flow. After the controller processes the request and returns a view name, dispatcher servlet uses view resolver to find the correct view. Then it shows the view and sends the response back to the user. How are different components like controller and view resolver integrated during a request? In Spring MVC, when a request comes in, the dispatcher servlet finds the right controller to handle it. The controller processes the request and decides which view to show. Dispatcher servlet then uses view resolver to find the correct view. The view is then created and sent back to the user as a response. Dispatcher servlet manages how these parts work together. Can you explain the role of the web application context? The web application context in Spring MVC is a special container for web applications. It stores and manages web-specific components like controllers and view resolvers. When a request comes in, dispatcher servlet uses the web application context to find and set up these components, making sure they work together to handle the request and create the response. How do you configure Spring MVC in a web application? To set up a Spring MVC in a web application, we first need to add a dispatcher servlet in the web.xml file. This servlet directs the incoming request to our controllers. Next, we can create a file called application-context.xml. In this file, we list all the components of our application such as controllers and services. We use annotations like @request mapping to connect URLs to controller methods. Lastly, set up a view resolver to link the names of views to the actual files like JSPs. What is the role of the web.xml file or Java config in setting up Spring MVC? The web.xml file or a Java config sets up Spring MVC by defining the dispatcher servlet, which handles incoming requests. In web.xml, we set up the servlet and its URL mapping. In Java config, we use a Java class to register dispatcher servlet. Both methods start the Spring application, connecting controllers, views, and other parts to manage web requests and responses. Can you describe how to set up a Spring MVC application without using a Spring web.xml? To set up a Spring MVC application without web.xml, create a class that implements web application initializer. In this class, register dispatcher servlet and configure it with a Spring configuration class, which is annotated with @configuration and @enable. web MVC. This Java setup starts the Spring application and connect request to the right controller and views. How do servlets and listeners contribute to the configuration? Servlets and listeners help set up and manage a web application. Servlets like Dispatcher Servlet handle incoming requests and direct them to the right parts of the app. Listeners like Context Loader listeners start and manage the application context and making sure everything is properly configured and ready to use. Together, they keep the web application running smoothly.